The dust swirled around Eleanor Ainsworth's worn boots as the train pulled away, leaving her utterly alone on the cracked platform of Corsicana, Texas. The late afternoon sun beat down with a relentless ferocity, mirroring the anxiety churning in her stomach. Her gloved hands clutched the strap of her meager satchel, her only tangible link to a life that had irrevocably changed in the span of a single, devastating telegram. Her father, a man whose gentle spirit had been no match for the ruthless currents of the burgeoning oil boom, was gone, and with him, their modest savings, swallowed by a bad investment he'd made in a desperate attempt to secure Eleanor's future. Now that future rested on the uncertain charity of a man she had never met, a distant relative by marriage, Mr. Julian Thorne. His curt, impersonal letter had offered her a position within his household, a vague role as a companion to his ailing mother. It was an offer born more of obligation than warmth, she suspected, but it was the only lifeline she had. Swallowing her pride, Eleanor adjusted the brim of her wide-brimmed hat, the only truly respectable item she still possessed. She would face this formidable Mr. Thorne, this titan of Texas oil, with the same quiet resilience that had seen her through her father's long illness. The town of Corsicana itself seemed to breathe an air of frantic prosperity. Roughnecks in oil-stained overalls crowded the streets, their laughter loud and boisterous, mingling with the clatter of wagons and the rhythmic clang of machinery. It was a world away from the quiet gentility of her upbringing, a world that felt both intimidating and strangely exhilarating. A sleek black automobile, gleaming under the harsh sunlight, idled near the edge of the platform. A uniformed chauffeur stood beside it, his expression impassive. Eleanor hesitantly approached him, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. "Excuse me," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you perhaps waiting for a Miss Eleanor Ainsworth?" The chauffeur's gaze swept over her, taking in her plain traveling dress and the worn satchel. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his features before he nodded curtly. "Miss Ainsworth, Mr. Thorne's instructions were precise. Please come this way." He held the car door open, and Eleanor stepped inside. The plush leather of the seats a stark contrast to the rough wooden benches she had endured on the train. The car pulled away smoothly, leaving the dusty platform behind. As they drove through the bustling town and then out onto seemingly endless stretches of sun-baked land, Eleanor's apprehension grew. What kind of man was Julian Thorne? What kind of life awaited her within his household? The Thorne estate loomed into view after what felt like an eternity. A sprawling mansion of stone and glass, surrounded by manicured lawns and towering oak trees. It exuded an air of cold grandeur, unwozing and unwelcoming. As the car approached the imposing front entrance, the heavy oak doors swung inward as if by command. Eleanor stepped out of the car, her gaze sweeping over the opulent entrance hall. Marble floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and a wide, sweeping staircase curved upwards towards unseen rooms. The air was still and silent, save for the distant tick-tock of a grandfather clock. It felt less like a home and more like a museum, beautiful but devoid of warmth. A stern-faced woman in a crisp black dress approached her. "Miss Ainsworth? I am Mrs. Davies, Mr. Thorne's housekeeper. Please follow me." Mrs. Davies' demeanor was as cold and unwelcoming as the house itself. She led Eleanor through a series of echoing corridors, past closed doors that hinted at the lives lived within. Finally, they arrived at a small, sparsely furnished room on the third floor. "This will be your room, Miss Ainsworth," Mrs. Davies stated, her tone flat. "Mr. Thorne will see you in his study after you have had a moment to refresh yourself." With that, she turned and left, the click of the closing door emphasizing Eleanor's isolation. The room was clean, but it felt temporary, impersonal. A narrow bed, a small writing desk, and a single wardrobe comprised the furniture. Eleanor placed her satchel on the bed, her shoulders slumping slightly. This was it then. Her new life. After washing her face and smoothing down her travel-creased dress, Eleanor descended the grand staircase, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and a strange, defiant resolve. Mrs. Davies was waiting for her at the foot of the stairs. "This way, Miss Ainsworth." She led Eleanor to a heavy oak door at the end of a long hallway. Mrs. Davies knocked once, then opened the door, stepping aside to allow Eleanor to enter. The study was a large, dimly lit room, lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, behind which sat a man who seemed to embody the very air of power and wealth that permeated the house. Julian Thorne rose as Eleanor entered. He was tall, his frame lean and imposing. His dark hair was impeccably styled, and his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, assessed her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. His features were sharp, aristocratic, and undeniably handsome, but there was a coolness in his gaze, a guardedness in the set of his jaw that hinted at a deeply reserved nature. He wore a tailored suit that spoke of expensive tastes and effortless authority. "Miss Ainsworth," his voice was deep and resonant, with a hint of a formal drawl. "I trust your journey was satisfactory?" Eleanor met his gaze, her chin held high despite the tremor in her hands. "It was adequate, Mr. Thorne. Thank you for your hospitality." The word felt hollow on her tongue. His lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. "Hospitality is perhaps not the most accurate description, Miss Ainsworth. I have offered you a position, a means of support, nothing more." His bluntness stung, but Eleanor refused to let it show. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Thorne. I am here to work, and I intend to earn my keep." "Indeed," he said, his eyes narrowing slightly as if intrigued by her unexpected directness. "Your primary duty will be to attend to my mother. Her health is delicate. She requires constant care and companionship." "I am accustomed to caring for the ill, Mr. Thorne," Eleanor replied quietly, the memory of her father's suffering a fresh ache in her heart. "I will do my utmost to make your mother comfortable." "See that you do," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "My mother is not easily pleased. You will reside here, attend to her needs, and otherwise remain discreet. You will not interfere in the affairs of this household, and you will certainly not discuss them outside of these walls. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Mr. Thorne." Eleanor's voice was steady, but beneath the surface a flicker of resentment began to simmer. He treated her as if she were nothing more than a hired hand, a necessary inconvenience. "Very well," he said, turning back towards his desk. "Mrs. Davies will show you to my mother's suite. You may begin your duties immediately." He dismissed her with a curt nod, his attention already focused on the papers before him. Eleanor followed Mrs. Davies out of the study, her mind reeling. Julian Thorne was every bit as cold and formidable as she had imagined, perhaps even more so. This was not the welcoming haven she had faintly hoped for, but a place of rigid rules and unspoken expectations. Mrs. Davies led her to a lavishly appointed suite on the second floor. The air here was heavy with the scent of lavender and medicine. Seated in a large armchair by the window was an elderly woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes sharp and assessing.
"Mother, this is Miss Ainsworth," Mrs. Davies announced. "She will be your new companion."
Mrs. Thorne's gaze rested on Eleanor, scrutinizing her from head to toe. "So, you are the one. Another charity case my son has taken in." Her voice was thin but laced with a distinct sharpness. Eleanor met her gaze calmly. "I understand that my presence here is due to Mr. Thorne's generosity, Mrs. Thorne. I assure you, I intend to be of service in any way I can." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Mrs. Thorne's lips. "We shall see, my dear. We shall see." Days turned into weeks, and Eleanor settled into the routine of caring for Mrs. Thorne. The elderly woman was indeed a difficult patient, prone to bouts of pain and sharp-tongued pronouncements. Yet beneath her prickly exterior, Eleanor sensed a deep loneliness, a yearning for genuine connection. She patiently listened to Mrs. Thorne's endless stories of the past, read to her for hours, and offered quiet companionship during her sleepless nights. Slowly, tentatively, a fragile bond began to form between them. Julian Thorne remained a distant figure, a fleeting presence in the grand house. He would occasionally inquire about his mother's health, his interactions with Eleanor always formal and brief. There was a wall around him, an impenetrable barrier that seemed to deflect any attempt at personal connection. Eleanor found herself observing him during the rare occasions they were in the same room, intrigued despite herself by the glimpses of something darker, something more complex, that flickered beneath his polished facade. One evening, as Eleanor was reading to Mrs. Thorne in the dimly lit sitting room, Julian entered unexpectedly. He paused in the doorway, his silhouette framed against the soft light of the hallway. "Mother, I have some news," he said, his voice low. Mrs. Thorne looked up, her eyes narrowing slightly. "What is it, Julian?" "The negotiations for the West Texas land have finally concluded," he announced. "The deal is done.
Thorn Oil has just secured the largest untapped reserve in the state. A triumphant gleam flickered in Mrs. Thorne's eyes. Excellent! I knew you could do it, Julian. Julian's gaze shifted to Eleanor, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his stormy eyes. This acquisition will solidify our position, Miss Ainsworth. It will ensure the future of this family for generations to come. Eleanor nodded, unsure of what response was expected of her. That is significant, Mr. Thorne. He studied her for a moment longer, his expression inscrutable. Then, with a curt nod to his mother, he turned and left the room as silently as he had come. Later that night, Eleanor found herself restless, unable to sleep. She wandered out onto the small balcony outside her room, the cool night air a welcome contrast to the stuffiness of the house. The grounds were bathed in the silvery glow of the full moon, the shadows long and distorted. From her vantage point, she could see a light burning in Julian's study. Drawn by an inexplicable impulse, she found herself gazing at the window, imagining him inside, poring over his papers, the master of his vast empire. There was something both compelling and unsettling about his solitary existence, his unwavering focus on his business, his seemingly complete lack of personal attachments. Suddenly, the study door opened, and Julian stepped out onto the small terrace adjoining his room. He stood there for a moment, his gaze lifted towards the moon, his hands thrust into the pockets of his trousers. In the soft moonlight, the harsh lines of his face seemed to soften, revealing a hint of vulnerability that Eleanor had never seen before. He looked lonely. A strange wave of sympathy washed over her, quickly followed by a sense of unease at her own audacity in observing him. She quickly retreated back into her room, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, Mrs. Davies informed Eleanor that Mr. Thorne would be hosting a large gathering that evening to celebrate the land acquisition. The entire household was in a flurry of preparations. As Eleanor helped Mrs. Thorne dress for the occasion, the elderly woman's eyes twinkled with anticipation. "It will be quite the affair, my dear. All the prominent families in Corsicana will be here. The oil barons, the real estate kings, and their ambitious daughters." Eleanor helped Mrs. Thorne adjust a delicate lace shawl, a knot of apprehension tightening in her stomach. She would be expected to be present, a silent observer in this glittering world of wealth and privilege, a stark reminder of her own reduced circumstances. Later that evening, the Thorne mansion was transformed into a dazzling spectacle of light, music. The grand ballroom shimmered with crystal and candlelight, and the air buzzed with the lively chatter of elegantly dressed guests. Eleanor, dressed in a simple but respectable gown that Mrs. Thorne had insisted upon, remained at the periphery of the festivities, assisting Mrs. Thorne and trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. Julian moved through the crowd with an air of effortless command, his presence drawing attention wherever he went. He was surrounded by a throng of admirers, both male and female, all vying for his attention. Eleanor watched him from a distance, a strange mixture of admiration and resentment snowing within her. He was undeniably magnetic, a force to be reckoned with, but there was still that underlying coolness, that sense of emotional detachment. As the evening wore on, Eleanor found herself increasingly uncomfortable. The noise and the press of the crowd were overwhelming, and she longed for the quiet solitude of Mrs. Thorne's sitting room. Just as she was about to slip away unnoticed, a deep voice spoke her name, "Miss Ainsworth." Eleanor turned to find Julian standing before her, his gaze direct and unwavering. He looked even more striking in formal attire, the stark white of his shirt a sharp contrast to the darkness of his suit. "Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. "My mother seems to have misplaced her spectacles," he said, his eyes scanning the room. "I believe she may have left them in the conservatory. Would you be so kind as to retrieve them for her?" It was a simple request, but the way he looked at her, the brief, almost imperceptible touch of his hand on her arm as he directed her towards the conservatory, sent a strange shiver down her spine. The conservatory was a tranquil oasis of lush greenery and fragrant blooms, a stark contrast to the bustling ballroom. The soft glow of lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on the glass walls. Eleanor searched for Mrs. Thorne's spectacles, her senses heightened by the unexpected encounter with Julian. She found the spectacles on a small table near a fountain, just as Julian entered the conservatory. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his imposing stature. "Thank you, Miss Ainsworth," he said, his voice low in the stillness of the room. He paused, his gaze lingering on her face. For a fleeting moment, Eleanor thought she saw something in his eyes, a flicker of something beyond the usual cool detachment. A spark? Curiosity? Or was it merely a trick of the light? "The celebration seems to be a success," she said, breaking the silence, her voice a little breathless. "Indeed," he replied, his gaze still fixed on her. "Business and pleasure often intertwine in this world, Miss Ainsworth. One must learn to navigate both with equal discretion."
There was an undercurrent in his words, a subtle intensity in his gaze that made Eleanor's heart beat faster. It was as if he were saying something more than what his words conveyed, a hidden message that she couldn't quite decipher. Before she could respond, a burst of laughter echoed from the ballroom, breaking the spell. Julian's expression shifted back to its usual guardedness. "I should return to my guests," he said, his tone becoming more formal. "Thank you again for your assistance, Miss Ainsworth." He turned and left, leaving Eleanor alone in the quiet of the conservatory, the scent of jasmine heavy in the air. She clutched Mrs. Thorne's spectacles in her hand, her mind racing. What had just happened? Had she imagined that brief moment of connection, that fleeting intensity in Julian Thorne's eyes? Later that night, as Eleanor lay in her bed, the sounds of the departing guests finally fading away, she couldn't shake the memory of that encounter in the conservatory. There was something about Julian Thorne that both intrigued and unsettled her, a magnetic pull that she couldn't deny, even as she recognized the vast chasm that separated their worlds. Just as she was finally drifting off to sleep, a soft knock sounded on her door. Eleanor sat up in bed, her heart pounding with a sudden premonition. Who could be calling on her at this late hour? She hesitantly opened the door to find Mrs. Davies standing in the dimly lit hallway, her face grave. "Miss Ainsworth," she said in a hushed tone, "Mr. Thorne requests your presence in his study immediately. It is urgent, urgent." Eleanor's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Had something happened to Mrs. Thorne? Had she somehow displeased Julian? She followed Mrs. Davies down the silent corridors, her apprehension growing with every step. When they reached the study door, Mrs. Davies opened it and stepped aside, her expression unreadable. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped into the room. Julian was standing by the window, his back to her, the city lights twinkling in the darkness beyond. The air in the study felt heavy, charged with an unspoken tension. He turned as she entered, his face shadowed and unreadable. "Miss Ainsworth," he began, his voice low and serious. "Something unexpected has occurred." Eleanor waited, her heart pounding in her chest. "There has been a complication regarding the West Texas land acquisition," he continued, his gaze fixed on hers. "A claim has been filed, alleging prior ownership. It could jeopardize the entire deal." Eleanor frowned, unsure of why he was telling her this. "I'm sorry to hear that, Mr. Thorne, but I fail to see how this concerns me." Julian's gaze intensified. "It concerns you, Miss Ainsworth, because the claimant is directly connected to you." Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. "Connected to me? I don't understand." "The claim was filed by a man named Silas Blackwood," Julian stated, his voice carefully controlled. "He alleges that the land rightfully belongs to his family, and he has produced documentation to support his claim." "Documentation?" Julian paused, his eyes piercing hers. "That includes a deed signed by your own grandfather." Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "My grandfather? But that's impossible. Our family never owned any land in West Texas." "Apparently they did," Julian said, his tone flat. "And Mr. Blackwood is determined to reclaim it. This could tie up our resources for years, potentially ruin everything I have worked for." He took a step closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "And here is where your connection becomes problematic, Miss Ainsworth. It appears that Mr. Blackwood is aware of your presence here. He has sent a message suggesting a private meeting." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "A private meeting? What does he want with me?" Julian's lips tightened. "I can only surmise that he believes he can use you to leverage his claim, to put pressure on me." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "The situation is delicate, Miss Ainsworth. If this claim goes forward, it could have serious repercussions for my company and for my family." He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "I need to know, Miss Ainsworth. Is there anything you haven't told me about your family? Anything that could explain this connection?" Eleanor stared at him, her mind racing, trying to make sense of his words. She knew nothing of any land claim, nothing of a Silas Blackwood. But Julian's intense gaze, the weight of his accusation, filled her with a growing unease. "There is nothing, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I swear it. I know nothing about this." Julian continued to study her, his expression unreadable. I hope for your sake, Miss Ainsworth, that you are telling the truth. Because if you are not, the consequences could be far-reaching for both of us." He turned away, his gaze fixed on the darkened city beyond the window. Eleanor stood there, alone and bewildered, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. The celebration of his triumph had turned into a night of ominous uncertainty, and Eleanor found herself caught in the center of a conflict she didn't understand. Her connection to Julian Thorne suddenly shifting from that of a mere employee to something far more complicated and potentially dangerous.
Sleep evaded Eleanor that night. She tossed and turned in her narrow bed, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and apprehension. Silas Blackwood. The name was unfamiliar, yet the accusation against her family, against her own integrity, stung deeply. Was it possible that her gentle, unassuming grandfather had harbored such a secret? And what could Silas Blackwood possibly want from her? The following morning, Julian was conspicuously absent from breakfast. Mrs. Thorne, however, regarded Eleanor with a new, unsettling intensity. There was a probing quality in her gaze, as if she were trying to discern Eleanor's guilt or innocence. "Julian seemed rather preoccupied last night," Mrs. Thorne commented, her voice deceptively casual as she sipped her tea. "Something about a land dispute, I believe." Eleanor hesitated, unsure how much she should reveal. "Mr. Thorne did mention a complication, Mrs. Thorne. A complication involving your family, I understand," the older woman pressed, her eyes sharp. Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "Mr. Thorne believes there is a connection, yes, but I assure you, Mrs. Thorne, I know nothing of any land claim in West Texas." Mrs. Thorne studied her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Perhaps not, but secrets have a way of surfacing, my dear, especially in families with a history." Her cryptic words sent a shiver of unease down Eleanor's spine. What did Mrs. Thorne know? Was there more to her own family history than she had ever been aware of? Later that morning, Mrs. Davies informed Eleanor that Mr. Thorne wished to see her in his study again. The summons filled Eleanor with a renewed sense of dread. Julian was standing by his desk when she entered, his expression grim. He held a thick file in his hand. "I have been reviewing the documents provided by Mr. Blackwood," he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. "The deed bearing your grandfather's signature appears to be legitimate." Eleanor's heart sank. "But how is that possible?" "That is what I intend to find out," Julian said, his gaze piercing. "Mr. Blackwood has insisted on this meeting. He will be arriving this afternoon." "Here? At Thorne Manor?" Eleanor asked, her voice rising in alarm. "He is demanding to speak with you directly," Julian stated, his jaw clenching. "He believes you hold the key to resolving this dispute. Perhaps some sentimental attachment to the land or some hidden knowledge." "But I have no such knowledge," Eleanor protested, her frustration mounting. "I have told you the truth, Mr. Thorne." "Then you will have to convince Mr. Blackwood of that," Julian said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This situation is intolerable. This man is threatening everything I have built." He paced the room, his agitation palpable. "He has made it clear that if his demands are not met, he will take this to court. A protracted legal battle could be disastrous." He stopped and turned to face Eleanor, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and a reluctant sort of desperation. "I will be present during this meeting. You will say nothing unless directly addressed, and you will follow my lead. Do you understand?" Eleanor nodded, her stomach churning with anxiety. She was being thrust into the middle of a high-stakes conflict, a pawn in a game she didn't even comprehend. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the study, as Silas Blackwood was ushered in by Mrs. Davies. He was a man of imposing stature, with a weathered face and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He exuded an air of quiet determination, a stark contrast to Julian's barely contained fury. "Mr. Thorne," Blackwood said, his voice deep and steady as he extended a hand. "Miss Ainsworth." His gaze lingered on Eleanor for a moment, assessing her. Julian shook Blackwood's hand curtly. "Mr. Blackwood, please, have a seat." The air in the study crackled with tension as the three of them settled into chairs. Julian wasted no time in getting to the point. "Mr. Blackwood, you have presented a claim to land that Thorne Oil recently acquired. A claim based on a deed purportedly signed by Miss Ainsworth's grandfather. Miss Ainsworth assures me she has no knowledge of this." Blackwood turned his attention to Eleanor, his gaze direct. "Miss Ainsworth,
Your grandfather was Thomas Ainsworth, correct? Yes, he was, Eleanor replied, her voice trembling slightly. And he resided in... Blackwood prompted. He lived in Boston for most of his life, Eleanor said, her brow furrowed. He never spoke of owning land in Texas. Perhaps he had his reasons for keeping it secret, Blackwood suggested, his eyes narrowing. The land in question was acquired during a time of considerable financial hardship for many. It's possible he sold it under duress, or perhaps... He paused, his gaze returning to Julian. Perhaps there were other arrangements made. Julian's jaw tightened. Are you implying foul play, Mr. Blackwood? I am merely stating possibilities, Mr. Thorne, Blackwood replied calmly. My family has held the oral history of this land for generations. The discovery of this deed confirmed what we always knew to be true. He turned back to Eleanor. Miss Ainsworth, does the name Ilara mean anything to you? Eleanor frowned, searching her memory. No, I don't believe so. Blackwood's gaze intensified. Ilara was your grandmother's given name. According to family lore, the land was a gift to her, a dowry of sorts. Eleanor stared at him, her mind reeling. She knew very little about her maternal grandparents. Her mother had rarely spoken of them. Could this be the missing piece of her family history? Julian watched the exchange intently, his expression a mixture of frustration and growing suspicion towards Eleanor. Mr. Blackwood, he interjected, his voice sharp. With all due respect, this is anecdotal. The deed itself is decades old. Thorne Oil conducted a thorough title search before purchasing the land. Title searches can be incomplete, Mr. Thorne, Blackwood countered smoothly, especially when dealing with transactions from that era. He turned back to Eleanor. Miss Ainsworth, I am not an unreasonable man. I understand that you may have no knowledge of this, but I believe that your family history holds the key to understanding what happened. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, worn, leather-bound journal. This belonged to my great-grandmother. It contains entries detailing the acquisition of the land and subsequent events. He opened the journal to a marked page and offered it to Eleanor. Hesitantly, Eleanor took the journal. The pages were brittle with age, the handwriting faded but legible. Her eyes scanned the entries, her breath catching in her throat as she read about a transaction involving land in West Texas and a man named Thomas, her grandfather, and a woman named Ilara, her grandmother. The entries were fragmented, filled with cryptic allusions to financial difficulties and a sense of betrayal. But one passage stood out, a heart-wrenching plea from Ilara about a promise broken and a piece of land that was rightfully hers. Tears welled up in Eleanor's eyes as she read the words, a sense of shock and a profound sadness washing over her. Could this be true? Had her family been wronged? Julian watched her reaction, his expression unreadable. Blackwood waited patiently, his gaze steady. I had no idea, Eleanor stammered, her voice choked with emotion. My father never spoke of this. Perhaps he didn't know either, Blackwood said gently. These are old wounds, Miss Ainsworth, but they still fester. Julian leaned forward, his voice sharp. Mr. Blackwood, what is it you want? If this deed is indeed valid, what is your proposition? I want what is rightfully mine, Mr. Thorne, Blackwood replied, his gaze unwavering. The land. That is impossible, Julian said flatly. Thorne Oil has invested a significant amount of capital in that land. Then perhaps we can come to another arrangement, Blackwood suggested, his eyes flicking to Eleanor. One that acknowledges the validity of my family's claim and also compensates Mr. Thorne for his investment. He paused, his gaze returning to Eleanor. Or perhaps Miss Ainsworth would be willing to intercede, to acknowledge her family's history and help us find a fair resolution. Julian's eyes narrowed, his suspicion towards Eleanor deepening. He saw the opportunity Blackwood was presenting, a way to potentially resolve the situation without a costly legal battle, but it hinged on Eleanor's willingness to cooperate. And he still didn't trust her. What do you say, Miss Ainsworth? Julian asked, his voice cool and calculating. Are you willing to involve yourself in this family matter? Eleanor looked from Julian to Blackwood, her mind reeling. She was caught between a man who viewed her with suspicion and a stranger claiming a connection to her past. The weight of their expectations pressed down on her. I need time to process this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is all a shock. Blackwood nodded understandingly. Of course, Miss Ainsworth. I will give you some time. But I urge you to consider what is right, for both our families. He turned to Julian. I trust we can continue this discussion at a later date, Mr. Thorne? Julian agreed curtly, his gaze still fixed on Eleanor. As Blackwood was shown out, the silence in the study was thick with unspoken accusations and unresolved questions. Well, Miss Ainsworth, Julian said, turning to face her, his eyes like chips of ice. "It seems your arrival has brought more than just companionship for my mother. You have brought a rather significant complication." "Mr. Thorne, I swear I knew nothing about this," Eleanor pleaded, her voice trembling. "Why would my father keep such a thing from me?" "Perhaps he had his reasons," Julian said dismissively. "Or perhaps you are not as innocent as you claim to be." His words were like a slap in the face. Eleanor stared at him, hurt and anger rising within her. How could he believe that she was somehow involved in this? "How can you say that?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "You think I would deliberately try to sabotage you?" "I don't know what to think, Miss Ainsworth," Julian replied, his gaze hard. "All I know is that this claim has surfaced now, just after your arrival, and it involves your family. It is a remarkable coincidence." "That is unfair," Eleanor cried, her eyes filling with tears. "You have no right to accuse me."
"Then explain it, Miss Ainsworth," Julian challenged, his voice cold. "Explain why your grandfather's signature is on that deed. Explain why your grandmother's name is so significant to Mr. Blackwood's family. Explain your sudden, convenient ignorance." Eleanor stared at him, her heart breaking. She had come to his house seeking refuge, and now he looked at her with nothing but suspicion and distrust. The fragile connection she had thought she glimpsed in the conservatory seemed to have vanished entirely, replaced by a wall of cold hostility. "I can't explain it, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Because I don't know, but I would never do anything to harm you or your family." Julian remained unmoved, his expression skeptical. "We shall see, Miss Ainsworth. We shall see." He turned away, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. Eleanor left the study, her heart heavy with despair. She retreated to her room, the weight of the day's revelations pressing down on her. She opened the small leather-bound journal again, her fingers tracing the faded script. Ilara, her grandmother. A woman she had never known, yet whose story was now inextricably linked to her own. As she read the fragmented entries, a sense of injustice began to stir within her. Her grandmother had clearly been wronged, and her father had either been unaware or unable to rectify the situation. Now, years later, Eleanor found herself caught in the middle, accused of complicity in a situation she had no part in creating. She looked out of her window at the sprawling Thorne estate, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. It was a world of wealth and power, a world that had offered her a temporary sanctuary, but now felt like a gilded cage. Julian Thorne, the master of this domain, viewed her with suspicion, his dominant presence casting a long shadow over her already uncertain future. But amidst the despair, a spark of defiance ignited within Eleanor. She would not be judged unfairly. She would uncover the truth, not only for herself, but for the memory of her grandmother, and perhaps, in the process, she would make Julian Thorne see beyond his preconceived notions and recognize the woman she truly was. That night, as a storm raged outside, mirroring the turmoil within her, Eleanor made a decision. She would write to the only relative she had left, a distant cousin of her father's who lived in Boston. Perhaps he knew something about her grandfather's past, about the land in West Texas, about Ilara. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. As she penned the letter, the wind howled outside, and a sudden clap of thunder shook the house. In the darkness, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the precipice of something significant, something that would irrevocably alter her relationship with Julian Thorne, for better or for worse. The next morning, Eleanor slipped the letter to her cousin into the outgoing mail, a fragile hope fluttering in her chest. She knew it would take time for a response, but it was a start. She had taken her first step towards uncovering the truth. Later that day, as she was tending to Mrs. Thorne, Julian entered the room, his expression still guarded, but perhaps a shade less hostile than the day before. "Miss Ainsworth," he said, his voice formal. "Mr. Blackwood has proposed a meeting to discuss a potential settlement. He wishes for you to be present." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I will attend, Mr. Thorne. I trust you understand the importance of this," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Your cooperation could be beneficial." Beneficial for whom? Eleanor wondered. For him? For his precious land deal? Or for the truth about her family? The days that followed the meeting with Silas Blackwood were marked by a subtle yet profound shift in the Thorne household. Julian's cold suspicion, once an impenetrable wall, had developed a few cracks. He no longer looked at Eleanor as a potential problem, but as a person,
a person of remarkable integrity who had voluntarily given up a claim to a fortune. He began to seek her out not for business but for conversation, his sharp questions probing her thoughts and opinions on everything from the design of the Thorne Gardens to the latest oil discoveries. One afternoon, Eleanor was reading to Mrs. Thorne when Julian entered the room, his expression unreadable. "Mother, the settlement with Mr. Blackwood has been finalized," he said, his voice clipped. "He has agreed to a fair price and the land is secure." A genuine smile graced Eleanor's lips. "I'm glad to hear it, Mr. Thorne. I am glad that a wrong has been righted." Julian's gaze lingered on her, a strange, unreadable expression in his eyes. He watched her for a long moment, a flicker of something new, something beyond grudging respect passing between them. He had been a man defined by his distrust, and she had been the first person to make him question it. That evening, Eleanor, feeling restless, wandered out onto the small balcony outside her room. The night air was cool, the scent of jasmine heavy in the stillness. Drawn by an inexplicable impulse, she found herself gazing at the light burning in Julian's study just as he stepped out onto the terrace below. He stood there for a moment, his gaze lifted towards the stars.
"The stars are different here,"
she said, her voice soft in the stillness. He looked up, his gaze finding her in the darkness. "They are, aren't they? Bigger, brighter." He remained silent for a moment, and then, to Eleanor's surprise, he spoke again. "My father used to bring me out here when I was a boy. He would point out the constellations. He wanted me to see the world not just for its resources, but for its wonder." It was the most personal thing he had ever said to her, a small window into the man he had been before he became the ruthless oil baron. Eleanor's heart ached with a sudden, overwhelming empathy for the boy who had lost his father and perhaps, in the process, a piece of his own heart. "He sounds like a good man," she said quietly. Julian's expression grew shadowed. He was, but a good man is not always a strong one. His rivals took advantage of his trust. They nearly bankrupted our family. I swore I would never be so vulnerable. The words were a revelation, a key that unlocked the mystery of his coldness, his guardedness. It wasn't a lack of emotion. It was a wall built to protect a heart that had been broken before. He turned his gaze from the stars to Eleanor, his eyes searching hers in the soft moonlight. The distance between their balconies felt immeasurable. Yet in that moment it was gone. "I have never met a woman like you, Eleanor Ainsworth," he said, his voice a low, rough murmur. "And I have never met a man like you, Julian Thorne," she replied, her own voice barely a whisper. He took a step towards her and then another until he was standing directly below her. He reached up, his hand resting against the stone railing. Eleanor, on a silent impulse, reached down and laid her hand over his. The heat of his skin, even through the thin fabric, sent a jolt of electricity through her. He looked from her hand to her face, his gaze intense and questioning.
In that moment, all the suspicion, the conflict, and the power imbalance between them vanished. There was only the undeniable pull, the shared vulnerability of the moment. He took her hand in his fingers intertwining with hers, and then, in one swift, aggressive motion, he pulled her towards him, his lips crashing against hers. It was not a gentle, questioning kiss. It was a kiss of overwhelming passion, a release of all the tension that had been building between them. Eleanor gasped softly as he deepened the kiss, a moment of raw, forbidden fire that seemed to ignite every part of her. She was a woman who had never been kissed, and now she was being kissed by a man who had never killed a woman like her. It was a promise, a question, and a surrender all at once. He pulled back, his breath ragged, his eyes searching hers in the moonlight. "Eleanor," he whispered, her name a plea on his lips. "Julian," she murmured in return, her heart pounding. They stood there for a long moment, their hands still intertwined, the unspoken words of a burgeoning love hanging in the air. The long-awaited romantic turning point had finally arrived, a fragile intimacy forged in the crucible of their shared vulnerability. But just as their connection seemed to solidify, a new threat emerged, a dangerous lie that would test their fragile trust and threaten to tear them apart. Later that week, Eleanor received a letter from her cousin in Boston. She had been eagerly awaiting his response, hoping for some new information about her family's past. As she read the letter, her heart sank. Her cousin knew nothing of any land in Texas. He also revealed a new detail about her grandfather. He had been a partner in a small, struggling real estate firm with a man who had left Boston years ago after a failed land deal. The man's name was Silas Blackwood. A cold dread washed over Eleanor. Why had Silas Blackwood lied? Why had he presented a story of injustice when he and her grandfather were partners? It could only mean one thing. Silas Blackwood was a liar,
and he had used Eleanor's innocence to leverage a fraudulent claim against Julian Thorne, and Eleanor had unwittingly helped him. She had stood by him, defended him, and in doing so, had betrayed the very man she had just kissed. She was rushing out of her room, the photograph and the letter clutched in her hand, desperate to find Julian and confess everything, when she collided with Mrs. Davies. The housekeeper looked at her with her usual stern expression, but this time, there was a triumphant glint in her eyes. "Mr. Thorne requests your presence in the study, Miss Ainsworth," she said, hoarse life laced with a cold satisfaction. "He has received a communication from Boston. It seems a mutual acquaintance has exposed a rather complicated matter." Eleanor's blood ran cold. He already knew. The truth was out. The lie had been exposed. The hard-won connection, the kiss they had shared, was about to be obliterated by a devastating betrayal.
Julian Thorne has sent a message. He requests her presence immediately. But why? Has he discovered the truth about her family's past before she could tell him herself? Or has he stumbled upon a lie far more dangerous than he could ever imagine? Find out in part 2. And don't go anywhere. Stay for the special song that perfectly captures the tension and longing of Julian and Eleanor's story.
Your eyes are a storm I can't walk through. Every step closer cuts me in two.
You speak in truths I don't wanna hear,
but I'm drawn to the sound, even when it's fear.
your silence is louder than shouting could be. You build your walls high, but they still call to me.
Every cold glance burns hotter than fire. I hate what you are, but you're all I desire. I hate to love you,
And I love to hate.
every word we trade
Feels like twisting fate.
we're poison and honey in the same breath we take. I hate to love you, but I can't escape. Your touch is a wound I keep tracing again, a sweet kind of war I'll never win.
You pull me in close, then you push me away, but my heart still leans where my mind says stay.
Your voice is a tether I can't cut clean. You haunt every shadow, every dream. I swear I won't fall, but the ground disappears when I'm caught in the pull of your gravity here. I hate to love you,
And I love to hate.
every word we trade
Feels like twisting fate.
we're poison and honey in the same breath we take. I hate to love you, but I can't escape.
You call me a liar, I call you a thief, stealing my trust, stealing my peace.
But the moment you're gone, I'm lost in the dark,
Hunting for pieces of your cruel, kind heart.
your shadow walks beside me unseen. I curse your name but you're stitched in my seams. I'm chained to the truth.
I can't let go. That the fire I fear is the one I know.
If love was a sin, we'd be saints in disguise.
If hate was salvation, we'd both be divine.
But we're caught in between, where the lines all blur, where I'm burning for you, though my hands still hurt. Every fight we fought just fans the flame, and every betrayal just sharpens your name.
We've broken each other, we've bled, we've lied, but somehow you're still the place I hide.
So damn the truth and damn the cost. I'll find you again, no matter what's lost. We're war and we're peace, we're shadow and light, and I'll hate to love you for the rest of my life. I hate to love you, and I love to hate. Every word we trade feels like twisting fate. We're poison and honey in the same breath we take. I hate to love you, but I can't escape. Your eyes are a storm I can't walk through, and I drown 1,000 times for you.